The book Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky takes readers into the shadowy world of mass media and propaganda. Now, when we think of propaganda, we often imagine those old World War II posters or state-controlled media in authoritarian regimes. But what if I told you that propaganda is alive and well, thriving in the very heart of our modern, democratic societies? The authors begin with a simple question. What is the primary function of the mass media? Most of us would say it's to inform, entertain, and keep us connected to the world. And while that's true, there's a deeper, more complex layer to it. According to what they call the propaganda model, the mass media also serve to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In other words, they're not just telling us what to think, but how to think, and ultimately, how to act. Herman and Chomsky further argue that in a world dominated by concentrated wealth and conflicting class interests, the media's role in shaping public opinion is not just incidental, it's systematic and deeply ingrained. The propaganda model identifies 5 key filters that shape the news we receive. First, ownership and profit orientation. The mass media are primarily owned by a small number of large corporations whose primary goal is profit. This means that news is often filtered through the lens of what will sell and what won't upset advertisers or powerful stakeholders. Second, advertising as the primary income source. Most media outlets rely heavily on advertising revenue. This creates a dependency on maintaining a favorable environment for advertisers, which can lead to self-censorship and a focus on content that appeals to affluent audiences. Third, sourcing from the powerful. The media rely heavily on government officials, business leaders, and experts, funded by these powerful entities for information. This reliance on official sources often means that dissenting voices are marginalized or ignored. Fourth, flak generation. Flak refers to negative responses to media content, ranging from letters and phone calls to lawsuits and boycotts. The ability to generate flak is often linked to power, and media outlets are acutely aware of the potential consequences of upsetting powerful interests. Lastly, anticommunism as a national religion. The ideology of anticommunism has historically been used as a powerful tool to mobilize public support for policies and actions that might otherwise be questioned. It serves as a framework for interpreting events and shaping public opinion. These filters interact and reinforce each other, creating a system where the news we receive is not just a reflection of reality, but a carefully curated version that serves the interests of those in power. Let's look at a concrete example. In the early 19th century, a radical press emerged in Great Britain that reached a national working-class audience. This press was effective in fostering class consciousness and promoting the idea that working people could affect social change through organized action. But this was seen as a major threat by the ruling elites. They attempted to suppress this alternative press through libel laws, expensive security bonds, and taxes designed to drive out radical media. However, these efforts were not successful. What ultimately accomplished what state intervention could not was the rise in scale of newspaper enterprise and the associated increase in capital costs. The market, driven by profit motives, effectively marginalized the working-class press. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history, with the media becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few powerful corporations. In the United States, for instance, the top tier of media companies, numbering between 10 and 24 systems, defines the news agenda and supplies much of the national and international news to the lower tiers. These media giants are large, profit-seeking corporations, owned and controlled by wealthy individuals. They are deeply integrated into the market system with powerful pressures from stockholders, directors, and bankers to focus on profitability. This trend toward greater integration of the media into the market system has been accelerated by the loosening of rules limiting media concentration and cross-ownership. The greater profitability of the media in a deregulated environment has also led to an increase in takeovers and takeover threats, forcing media giants to incur greater debt and focus even more aggressively on profitability. But here's where the propaganda model really comes into play. The media's reliance on advertising and their need to maintain good relationships with powerful sources often leads to a systematic bias in their coverage. This pattern of manipulation and systematic bias is not always obvious. It requires both a macro and micro view of media operations to see the pattern. The propaganda model helps us understand how the media's choices about what to report and how to report it are shaped by the interests of powerful entities. The propaganda model also helps explain the media's coverage of elections in third world countries. In U.S. allied countries like El Salvador, elections were held under conditions of severe state terror, yet the media often portrayed them as legitimate exercises in democracy. In contrast, elections held in countries like Nicaragua, which were not aligned with U.S. interests, were often criticized and portrayed as illegitimate. For example, the elections in El Salvador in 1982 and 1984 were held under conditions of ongoing state terror, with the army and paramilitary forces committing widespread human rights abuses. Yet, the media focused on superficial aspects of the elections, such as voter turnout and the mechanics of voting, while ignoring the basic conditions that make an election meaningful, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to organize. In Nicaragua, the 1984 election was held under much more favorable conditions, with greater freedom of speech and assembly, and a lack of the state terror that plagued El Salvador. However, the U.S. government and the media went to great lengths to portray the Nicaraguan election as a farce and a sham, focusing on alleged flaws in the electoral process and downplaying the fact that the election was relatively free and fair. The model predicts that the media would accept and promote a narrative that aligned with the interests of powerful entities, even if it was based on flimsy evidence. It also explains why the media fail to critically examine the evidence and the motivations of the sources promoting the said narratives. The media's reliance on official sources and their tendency to accept the government's version of events often lead to a one-sided coverage that ignores alternative explanations and dissenting voices. In conclusion, the propaganda model put forward by Herman and Chomsky provides a powerful framework for understanding how the mass media operate in a world dominated by concentrated wealth and conflicting class interests. It reveals the systematic bias and manipulation that shape the news we consume and highlights the need for a more critical and discerning approach to media consumption. This has been a BrightLearn video from BrightLearn.ai on the book Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. Visit BrightLearn.ai for more fascinating videos like this one, and visit naturalnews.com for full editorial coverage and breaking news on critical stories that keep you informed and aware of what's really going on.